Hi, second grade. Welcome to reading lesson 9. I am so excited to think back about some of the books that we have read together throughout this year. Books like Yasmin the Fashionista, Poppleton and Winter, and Block Party Surprise. You are growing as a second grade reader with bigger books and chapters that are in those books, just like these books. As we've been thinking about how stories are structured, it's important that we think about how an author structures a chapter book story because so many of you are ready for chapter books right now. That's going to be our goal today. I can determine if the structure of a chapter book is multi-story or single story. We're going to talk about what those words mean and how we can decide if our chapter book is a multi-story or a single story. Let's get started. Throughout Module C, you have really been studying how stories take us on a ride and how stories are structured with important events that happen in the beginning, the middle, and the end. But did you know that chapter books have a very special kind of structure as well? We call this a multi-story or a single story. Let's talk first about multi-story. Do you notice at the beginning of multi-story we have multi? Just like the word multiple. You learned that multiple means more than one. Well, multi-story means more than one story. When a chapter book is set up like a multi-story book, it has many small stories inside the chapter book. Each chapter has its own problem and solution. You could pull the chapter out of the book and it would make sense all by itself. If that's the case, it is a multi-story chapter book. Other chapter books have a structure called a single story. That means that all the chapters are connected to one main problem. So each chapter is building on the next part of the story and the next part of the story, and the whole book, from beginning to end, has one big ride. So there isn't many different problems and many different solutions. You couldn't pull a chapter out all by itself and it would make sense. The whole story is one big story mountain. Let's practice looking at some of the books that we've read to decide if they are multi-story or single story. Let's practice this work using some of the books that we have read together as a class. I want you to have either your reader's notebook or a piece of paper if you don't have a reader's notebook in front of you. I want you to make this T-chart in your reader's notebook. On one side, have it say multi-story, and on the other side, have it say single story. Pause the video while you make this T-chart and then push play when you're ready to keep going. Okay, ready to keep going? Let's do a quick review. Which of these is a story or a book where each chapter is its own story? So it has lots of stories inside of one book. Put your finger on the one that shows a book that has more than one story in it. Did you put your finger on multi-story? That's right. A multi-story chapter book has lots of little mini stories inside of it. Each chapter has its own problem and solution, its own setting, its own characters. Now, put your finger on the side that shows that there are more than one chapter, but it's one big story from beginning to end. Did you put your finger on single story? That's right. A single story chapter book is one where there's one big problem and solution, one big story, a single story, even though there are more than one chapter. All right, let's take a look back at some of the books we've read to see if we can figure out what kind of structure they have. Think about the book Yasmin the Fashionista. Yasmin the Fashionista has 3 chapters in it. Was this book a multi-story or a single story? Was each chapter a new story about Yasmin, or was there one big story from beginning to end? Think about that for a minute and write it on your T-chart. Write the title of this book either under multi-story or single story. Pause the video while you write. All right, did you put it under single story? Yasmin the Fashionista was one story from beginning to end. Each chapter built on the chapter before it and told a little bit more of the story until we got to the end. Let's think about this book, Poppleton and Winter. Was this story, or was this book, a multi-story where there are lots of different stories inside of it, each chapter with its own problem and solution, its own characters, its own setting? Or was this one big story from beginning to end? Pause the video and write the title Poppleton in Winter, either under multi-story or single story. Go ahead, pause the video and write. Where did you put it? Did you put it under multi-story? That would be right. Remember, in Poppleton in Winter, we had the story Sleigh Ride that had its own problem and solution. We had the story Icicles, where there was even different characters in there because it was Poppleton and the Finch was in that story. And there were other stories in there too. Each chapter you could pull out and make its own story all by itself. So that was a multi-story chapter book. Okay, readers, it's time for independent reading. Here's your job during independent reading. First, I want you to revisit Block Party Surprise, the chapter book we just finished reading together. You can scan the book or you can reread it. And I want you to think, is this a multi-story chapter book or a single-story chapter book? Determine if the book has a multi-story or single-story structure and add it to the T-chart that we made together on the previous slide. Then I want you to explore your own independent reading books, or think about other books you have read and add them to your chart as well. If you're at home, you could go on a book hunt. Look through all the books in your house. Find books that are multi-story chapter books and write their titles on your T-chart. Find other books that have a single story structure and add those to your T-chart. If you're in your classroom, maybe you could ask your teacher to loan you a few chapter books that you could sort if you don't have any in your independent reading bag. I want you to enjoy exploring your books, thinking about story structure and what kind of chapter book you have. When your independent reading time is all finished, head back to the Nearpod so you can reflect on your lesson. Have fun!